Okay, can I have everyone's attention? Thank you. It was Thursday, March 5th, 2020, when we were last in this room. So almost 2 years ago to the day when we were last together for the director's seminar. So thank you for coming out. Thanks to Josh, who seems to have escaped, for helping us be able to make the most out of our noon hour and get to eat and get to hear some great science as well. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. The director's seminar speaker is Ying Diao from the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department. Josh, you didn't get to hear me say thank you for getting us back together and feeding us lunch. Let me tell you a little bit about Ying, but before I do that, I just want to remind you that the director's search is still available, is open, and I think that, well, you're online, Patty will put a link in, but if you know anyone who would be interested in the position, then make sure you encourage them to apply. So today we're privileged to have Ying Diao, Professor Ying Diao, speak on her research. Ying was an undergraduate at Tsinghua University in Peking. If you don't know much about Tsinghua, then I would say you should go online and look at it, because you may recognize that the architecture of their quad has a striking resemblance to the architecture of our quad. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that story. I was fortunate to stand on that and wonder if I was halfway across the globe or whether I was in our own backyard about 10 years ago. After her time in Peking, she then went to Cambridge and earned her master's degree and PhD in chemical engineering at MIT. Then she traveled across the country to Stanford, where she did a postdoc before coming to the University of Illinois and taking her current position. She's associate professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering. She is the recipient of the NASA Young Investigator Award that she's going to use to excite us about the future of thinking about growing plants non-terrestrially and how we want to be able to monitor them better. And Ying's specialty is really in that area of fabrication, thinking about controlling materials from the molecular level all the way up to the macro scale, and really combining integrated self-assembly together with design, synthesis, and fabrication. So with that, Ying, thank you for getting us back together again, and we're looking forward to hearing about the work you have to tell us.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah, it's a great honor to be here. And actually, last time I gave the in-person seminar was back in 2 years ago as well. So I'm really excited for the opportunity to give in-person seminars again. And as Jeff said, I came from Tsinghua University, and the quad was designed by the same architect as Bollinger Auditorium, and that's the reason I joined Illinois. In case you didn't realize it.
On the slide?
Oh yes, that's a Bollinger, the dome, right? So for much of the talk today, I will be grounded on Earth, and then very briefly towards the end, I will take you to Mars. So I hope that's not too disappointing to you. Oops. All right, so we heard over and over again how important manufacturing is to creating jobs and to advance economy. But the other side of the story is that manufacturing consumes a lot of the energy and produces a lot of waste as well. So it consumes 1/3 of the world's energy, uses 20% of global water, and produce 1/3 of CO2 emissions and millions of tons of waste per year. So that's according to United Nations Industrial Development Organization. We've got to do it better. Basically, how to innovate manufacturing to become sustainable. For example, if we look at how semiconductors are made, so most of my group focus on semiconductors. That is the silicon in our computer and on our roof. It starts from a process called Zoltrowski growth. It's developed by a physical chemist, Zoltrowski, back a century ago. See the reference on the bottom? Essentially, well, it was a nice story. So one day he was deep in thought, reading a book, and then he accidentally dipped his pen into molten tin on his desk. And then when he drew out his pen, he saw a single crystalline tin at the tip of the pen. So at the time, he didn't anticipate this was critical to semiconductor manufacturing. But 50 years later, it was picked up to manufacture semiconductors. Basically, you will use a sealing rod to dip into molten silicon and then pull out a high purity single crystalline ingot. So despite the ingenuity of the process, actually, it requires a lot of energy to do. As you can see, you have to melt silicon. And after you get these giant ingots, you will slice it down in a reductive process and then package it into a solar cell or tiny circuits. So these reductive manufacturing processes are inherently energy intensive as well, because you have to cut things to break chemical bonds. So because of how energy intensive manufacturing is, we have to use the solar cells by 2 to 3 years to compensate for the manufacturing cost. The energy cost during manufacturing. So that's the energy payback time being 2 to 3 years for our silicon panels on the roof. Also, for each ton of silicon, 4 tons of organic waste are produced. So it's hugely environmental costly. However, if we can make solar cells in a way that we make newspapers, basically at ambient conditions using printing, then we can potentially drastically reduce the energy consumption. So this is a video showing you roll-to-roll printing of organic solar cells developed by a Danish startup, Infinity PV. In fact, there is a big push of organic PV commercialization in Europe. So here is a picture of a printed organic solar tree for electronic bikes in Germany that was recently installed. So in terms of energy consumption, if we print organic solar cells, the energy payback time can be as short as 1 day. So that's a drastic reduction from 2 to 3 years for traditional silicon PV. And further, the manufacturing is high throughput. Because of that, we can potentially address the 1 gigawatt per day challenge. So that's the challenge that we have to meet, because there's a growing energy demand by 1 gigawatt per day. So that's a huge jump in energy demand every day. But then if you look at the silicon PV that's been installed so far, it's only hundreds of gigawatts, because the production rate is just too slow for silicon PV to catch up to the energy demand increase. But for organic solar cells, because we can print it in a way that will make newspapers, we can potentially address this rapid energy demand increase due to the throughput of production. So that's just one of the examples of how we can revolutionize advanced material manufacturing using printing. And there are many other examples, such as printing batteries or thermoelectrics, etc. So talking about printing technologies, actually, we have come a really long way. As we learn in history books, printing has been developed back in Tang Dynasty using essentially a transfer printing method by developing a mold and step on the surface. So fast forward to the 21st century, a lot of innovations have happened to rejuvenate the printing technologies. So the first one being digital revolution, that's embodied by 3D printing. So one of the major advances of 3D printing is the seamless integration between software and hardware. So this is the first patent that documented the integration between hardware and software for 3D printing. That was almost as old as myself. So basically, the CAD CAD represent computer-aided design. So you can conceptualize any objects you want to print, and then that is converting to G code to direct the X, Y, Z motorized stage to print an actual object. So because of digital revolution, the 3D printers are now in the hands of everyday citizens. So another opportunity or challenge is to control assembly during printing. So when we print newspapers, we really don't care about how the ink particles assemble. But when we print functional materials, for example, electronics, photonics, it's essential to be able to exactly place atoms where they need to be, or molecules with the right conformation and positioning. And this has been identified as one of the major challenges of transforming manufacturing by Department of Energy only 2 years ago. So it still remains a challenge, but also opportunities for us to innovate in this space. So the third advancement that is just getting started is the autonomous revolution. This video shows you a mobile chemist, basically a robot that can self-optimize photocatalyst formulations so that we can better split water into oxygen and hydrogen to create solar fields, essentially. So while using robots in manufacturing is nothing new, actually, it's been there for several decades. But the important distinction here is that these robots can think and make decisions by themselves. Based on the data they collected, they can think about what's the next step to take, enabled by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So, well, this example is not relevant to printing, but actually the autonomous revolution is coming to the additive manufacturing domain just in the last few years. So in part one, I will be thinking about how to address a major challenge in printing, and that is that when we want to apply printing to functional materials, we have to improve their properties, because if you look at solar cells, why it's not commercially available yet? Well, because the printed solar cells have much lower performance than silicon PV, and also if you were to make organic solar cells in a different way than printing. So we'll adopt a two-pronged approach. One is that we hypothesize that assembly is essential to control structure and properties. So we'll use a physics-based approach, but gaining fundamental insight of the assembly process so that we can enhance the properties of the materials we print. And an alternative approach is to say that, well, let's not spend too much time figuring out how things works, but rather let's just go into a lab and do many, many, many experiments over and over again. So with the data collected, we see if there is a trend with a trend between parameters and properties, and then decide what to do next. So that's basically an Addisonian trial error approach, but then accelerated by automation and machine learning. So we think that the two approaches are complementary, and then they can mutually enhance each other. So in part 1A, I will be talking about a polymer system, that is polymer optoelectronics. So if you're using a smartwatch or smartphone, most likely you're already using organic electronics. Well, however, in these screens, actually, the materials are not printed or evaporated because for the same reasons that printing produces lower performance materials. So that's why these screens are really, really expensive still. And so that's the one commercialized area for polymer electronics. In the near future, we can imagine to put transparent solar cells on any surface to generate electricity from sunlight. Or we can imagine to wear thermoelectrics on our skin that can convert the temperature difference from the skin to the environment, convert that thermal energy into electricity to power devices. Or we can imagine to fill our cars with solar fields. Basically, we can use photocatalysts to convert solar energy into chemical fields to power our cars. So all these futuristic technologies can be enabled by polymer optoelectronics. And here shows you a prototypical electronic polymer electronics that is based on conjugated polymer. Basically, these materials, the hallmark of these are already single double bonds along the polymer backbone. And that enables the electrons to delocalize along the polymer chain. So recently our community has figured out that the conformation of these polymers are really important to charge transport. Even a small twist. So if you look at the side view of this polymer, it is almost planar, but there is small twists between the aromatic rings. Even that can localize the charge carriers drastically. So it's essential to control the conformation. And these polymers can stack together, driven by strong pi-pi interactions. And that enables another transport mode from chain to chain, in addition to zipping a charge along the polymer chain. And surrounding these crystalline domains are amorphous domains. So we have to shuttle carriers between crystalline domains using tie chains. And the community has figured out that alignment of the chains are very important to expedite charge transport. So you can see that, well, this is an example of a simple transistor device that underpins a lot of electronics. You can see that there is a complex multiscale morphology we have to control during printing, and that can drastically tune electronic properties by orders of magnitude, even with small changes, such as twist. So one of the advantages of polymer electronics compared to silicon is that they are printable, and there is really a wide range of printing technologies have been applied to printing electronics. And they vary depending on how we apply the ink to a substrate. So although the list looks dazzling, there are just too many. But if you lift the curtain to look at the physics, there is only two types of physics that's at play. One is a dry and drop problem that resembles how you spill coffee on the table and then see how the coffee droplet dries. So this is underpinning, for example, inkjet printing. And another type of problem is moving drying meniscus. Basically, if the substrate or the ink applicator is being moved, then we'll drag out the meniscus that'll define the evaporation and assembly process. So this underpins most of the meniscus printing techniques. Basically, to put it simply, it resembles how we apply butter on the bread using a blade. To get a little bit technical, it's really fascinating to look at the transport processes during solution printing. For a dry and drop problem, the physics has been figured out through the coffee ring phenomenon back in 1997. So if you are familiar with coffee ring, basically if you drop coffee on the table, you will see a ring that's being formed after the droplet dries. And that's because that there's uneven evaporation profile modulated by curvature of the ink-air interface. So the evaporation rate radically increases when you get to the triple phase contact line. And because of this profile of evaporation, it pulls the ink from the center to the edge through a flow called capillary flow, and that drives the particles to deposit on the edge. So during inkjet printing, the physics is essentially the same. And another type of transport process is governed by Marangoni flow. So due to the evaporation profile being uneven, there is a temperature concentration gradient at the ink-air interface. So that can drive an interfacial tension-driven flow. That's a Marangoni flow. And if we start moving the substrate or the ink applicator, we introduce another flow type. So that flow is driven by the substrate moving. basically ink wants to stay with the substrate. That's called viscous drag force. And that the flow resembles flow between parallel plates, which we call Couette flow. So you can see that the transport processes are really complex in these seemingly very simple printing processes. And they define a very complex environment for the polymer molecules to assemble. So our question is that how do we know how the polymers assemble in this complex environment? And if we know it, we can potentially control the assembly process using printing down to the molecular scale. So we hypothesized that during printing, the assembly pathway is drastically different from what is known. So this is a pathway that's been figured out a few years ago. If you were to put a polymer in a vial and cool it down to assemble, so we know that the polymers will first planarize at lower temperature, and then they will aggregate, and different parts of the polymer may crystallize separately. For example, the backbone side chain can crystallize in separate steps. And that'll form nanofibers, and the nanofibers can assemble in a colloidal fashion. But then we're saying this pathway can be radically modified when we look at printing. And in the spirit of Beckman Institute, I would like to highlight that it's a team effort, as a team science, that we worked with David Belgian from University de Mans at Belgium, who did DFT calculations to help us look at the electronic structure of polymers. And Diwakar Shukla a group did molecular dynamics to help us understand the structure of the polymers in solution. And Tian Chen group at material science here did electron microscopy to review nanoscale structures of these polymers. And the work is mainly done by Dr. Kyung-Sin Park and Justin Clark of my group. So first, I would like to show you printing near equilibrium. Basically, when we print very slowly, what's the molecular assembly pathway? So we looked at two very simple printing processes. One is a blade-driven process. The other is a pen writing process. And then we compared two polymers that are very similar. One is a copolymer that is slightly twisted if you look at the DFT calculations, the side view. And the other is more planar. When we replace the benzyl ring with a falcon ring, we reduce the stereo hindrance between oxygen and sulfur, and therefore planarize the polymer. But you can see the difference is very subtle. But nonetheless, we found two radically different pathways between the two polymers. So for the twisted polymer, we saw that that if we print slowly, we see before the ink dries into a polymer thin film, we observe a blue phase, which is a chiral crystal mesophase. So that is very surprising to us because the polymer itself is achiral. Whereas when we print the planar polymer, we bypass the mesophase altogether. And we observe this phenomenon again using another pair of polymers based on diketopyroviral. Again, the twisted polymer goes through a chiral crystal phase, whereas the achiral polymer bypasses the crystal phases. You can see that the texture of the film are really different, and as well as the properties in the end. So what's intriguing is how chiral polymers can give rise to chiral structures. So we determined that actually what underpins chirality is the helical structure. So we show that because the backbone of the polymer is highly twisted, slightly twisted, it can assemble in the solution phase as helix. So shown by MD calculations. And we show that basically how helix forms is because the dihedral angles are correlated. Basically, if you look at this dihedral between the two falcon rings, if it twists in one way, the next falcon dihedral will also twist the same way. So they want to twist in the same way. That's why they can form helix over long range. And another essential aspect is that these wavy polymers can stack in a staggered fashion to aggregate into helical fibers. So that's shown by DFT calculations that that the the pipette stacking happens in a staggered fashion. So the indigo ring and the selfie ring, they stack at 45-degree angles, which is a global minima. So that's very different from traditionally how we think about stacking between these polymers. Usually we think they're cofacial, but actually they're staggered. And that enabled such helical assembly to happen. So we actually, having imagined this structure and validated by electron microscopy, really changed how we think about the structure of these polymers, because usually people think of them as layered structures driven by pipette stacking, but they can assemble into helix. As we'll show that this can radically change the electronic properties. So next, we really want to understand when we print far from equilibrium, what happens to assembly pathway. So can we tune the assembly pathways using printing processes? So we carried out finite element simulations. So that was done by grad student Justin Clark. So just now I was showing you the evaporation regime where we evaporate slowly. So recall the coffee ring phenomenon where the deposition occurs at the triple phase contact line. And if we print faster and faster, we enter a different regime where we drag out a tail, a liquid tail that cannot be fully evaporated. So the liquids will return to the bulk of the ink. And this returning flow creates a high strain rate pocket shown in this view. So that's the strain rate plot where the red color indicates high strain rate region, whereas the blue color are low strain rate regions. So if we print even faster, you can see that this red pocket will grow bigger and bigger. So we essentially show that later, as I'll show that these red pockets have profound implications on assembly pathways. So if we, in the evaporative regime where the red pocket is absent, we assemble through chiral crystal phase and to result in a ramming noodle morphology. Whereas when we enter into a transition regime where the red pocket is present, we then stretch out the polymer driven by high strain rate of the printing flow. And then we deposit a film that resembles line spaghettis. So basically this shows that printing offers the opportunity to tune polymer structures down to the molecular level, and that propagates all the way to micron scale. So, well, how does that matter? Because even small changes in the polymer conformation can radically change optoelectronic properties. So we made these to assess how charge transport, the speed of a charge carrier is different in these different polymer structures. We made these transistor devices. Basically, what you're looking at is an orange film that is the conjugated polymer thin film that's being printed. And the black regions are electrodes. So we measure the charge transport between the two electrodes over 360 degrees. And then we found that, so for the chiral crystal mediated assembly pathway, there is no modulation of the speed of the charge carrier when we do this 360 degrees. And the charge carrier mobility, which is the speed of the charge carrier, remains low. Whereas when we stretch out the polymer, we then preferentially transport along the polymer backbone. So that's these high points along the polymer backbone direction. And also the charge carrier mobility, the speed of the charge carrier is significantly enhanced by 3 to 4 times. So that's telling us that the planar backbone, although we only planarize by 10 to 20 degrees of the torsion, that can drastically enhance the speed of the charge carrier. But then helical structures has fascinating properties. So for one, we found that it can significantly enhance charge generation in organic solar cells. So here illustrates the basic physics of organic solar cells. That's comprised of a polymer that's electron withdrawing and another polymer that is electron donating. So when the light comes in, it'll generate an exciton. Basically, it's a tightly bound electron hole pair. And the exciton would, illustrated here, the exciton would either recombine to re-emit photon, or it can diffuse into the boundary of the two materials and split into charge carriers. So we would like them to split rather than recombine so that we can generate electricity. So when we, because of the ability to tune the helical structures using printing, we were able to compare the helical with planar structure. And we show that, so this is photoluminescence spectroscopy. Basically, I draw your attention to the solid lines here. So for the helical structure, if we blend the two materials together, that's the blue line, we can quench the recombination process of excitons, basically quench a fluorescence. This means that there are more excitons that diffuse to the boundary to split rather than recombine to emit photon. But then for the planar structure, the photoluminescence hardly changed when we blend the electron acceptor into the electron donor. So this means that even if we introduce a lot of interfaces, the excitons do not split. So most of them are still emitting photons and by recombination. So this tells us that helical structures can radically increase the charge generation. So this offers hope that we can tune the polymer structures so that we can potentially enhance the solar cell performance, which we're trying to work on now. But I think the key message is that by understanding the semi pathways, we can use printing to control the helical structures on demand. Based on different applications, we can tune it to cater it. And so next, I would like to show you that the concept we have developed that controlling assembly group printing can be applied to another class of polymer that exhibits structured color. So structured color is really fascinating. Who doesn't love chameleons, right? And chameleons, actually only recently did we figure out how does it work? Why does it change color the way it does? So actually there are these Guanyin nanoparticles embedded on its skin. And upon excitation, the spacing between the Guanyin nanoparticles would change. And that is on the order of the wavelength of light. And therefore the color can change upon excitation. So this approach is really smart because it can enable structured color to be dynamic. However, well, if you look at how we make colors, it's mainly based on synthetic dyes. So not only is it static, but also it's a major environmental pollutant. Well, globally, every year we make 1 million tons of organic dyes, and then 2 to 10% of them end up in water. So that's one of the biggest threats to the environment, as stated in this book. So our goal is what if we can design, we can enable these structured colors the way that chameleon does, and then replace some of these dyes to help mitigate environmental pollution. And our chameleon team is shown here. So I'm working with 3 other chemical engineers in my department. Chelsea focuses on simulation, and Dina Grone look at synthesis, and Simon Rogers help us understand rheology. So the results I will show is mainly done by Bijal Patel in my group, and the molecules are made by Dylan Walsh. So Bijal is now an NRC postdoc fellow at NIST, and then Dylan is a postdoc at MIT. Okay, so here is the polymers that can potentially enable dynamic structured color. It's called Bottlebrush block of polymers. So it has gotten this polynormaline backbone, and there are 2 distinct chemical blocks. One is based on PMS, the other is PLA. They have different chemistries that I didn't show here. So this polymer is literally looking like a bottle brush because there are these hairs densely grafted on the backbone. And the reason why this is interesting is because if you don't graft the side chains, the polymers are actually very, very flexible. So they fold and densely packed so that when they assemble into these lamella layers, the spacings are actually very small, 10 of nanometers. But then when you graph these arms, the polymer becomes much more rigid. So the spacing goes into the visible range, about 1 to 200 nanometers. And that creates vivid structure color for this material. So in the literature, people have tuned the assembly, the photonic properties of these materials by changing the polymer themselves or the composition. But here we're saying that we want to achieve tuning of structure color by printing. And we designed, well, we bought these commercial 3D printers and then we designed our own printhead and made our own software. And when we print the polymer, we hypothesize that we can tune the assembly process of the polymer conformation so that we can tune the photonic properties on the fly. And indeed, we showed that we can simply tune very simple printing parameters, just the printing speed and the substrate temperature. We can access a really wide palette from red all the way to blue. So you can see that the spacing actually varies very largely, over 70 nanometers. So that's a very wide space that we can tune simply by printing. Okay. Oh, I think, yeah, I think I'm loud enough, I think. All right. So, well, we want to understand how this process works so that we can better design the printing processes to control structure color. So essentially, we figured out that the assembly pathway is driven by concentration. Basically, when we increase concentration of the polymers as the solvent evaporates, we drive the polymer to assemble into these macrophase separated structures. And what's important is that the later stage of assembly, the polymer becomes straighter and straighter. So the spacing at the nanoscale becomes larger and larger. So basically, we're evolving from blue to red during the assembly process. And then the question is how the printing controls the spacing. So it actually do so by setting the assembly time that we figured out. That we've determined the printing time scale varies, well, as a function of printing speed. Basically, the faster we print, the bluer, the slower, the faster the drying time and the bluer we get. And then we also separately map out the assembly time. And most importantly, we figured out that the drying time actually set the assembly time. Basically, if we dry faster and faster, we arrest the assembly before it reaches equilibrium, and therefore arresting the bluer state. So here shows the mechanism that we determined. Basically, as the polymer assembles, it evolves from blue to red because the spacing is progressively increasing when we pack the polymers closer and closer. The polymer become more rigid. But then if we remove all the solvent before we reach the equilibrium state, we then arrest the structure at bluer metastable state. But then if we heat up the substrate, we then push the assembly faster and faster so that we can arrive at a redder state earlier. And with this insight, we essentially simply program the printing process and we made these colorful prints by without changing the ink materials. So imagine that you have one single pigment and then you shuffle it into the printer and then it can create a colorful image without you having to change the structure of the ink or the composition. So that's the power of how printing tunes, understanding how printing tunes assembly can give us the dynamic on-the-fly control. And in fact, this chameleon showed up in 2 French children magazines that flew all over the globe while we published the paper. Well, that's the physics-based approach. So moving forward, we really want to push this project forward by being able to print real 3D structures. So going from 2D to 3D, and also to bring the plane structures to life, to make it really dynamic like chameleons. And you can imagine how complex this process will be, because now there's so many parameters we have to tune. So we then leverage data science driven approach again to develop this closed loop autonomous discovery and additive manufacturing for dynamic structure color. And that'll be in collaboration with Dr. Benjamin Maruyama of Air Force Research Lab. Okay, so next, for the next few minutes, buckle up, and then we'll take a brief trip to Mars. So, well, what if some of us have to become Martians one day? Well, hopefully we don't have to be if we can solve the sustainability problem on Earth. But just in case, so NASA have envisioned these enclosed chambers the vegetable growth units that can be landed on Mars to produce food. So as you may have seen the movie Martians, it's incredibly important to grow food on Mars. And if we go inside to take a look, this is an envisioned view of a vegetable growth unit on Mars. So the environment for plants are very, very different. That the lighting will be provided by LEDs, red, blue, green LED light. And also, because of the lack of proper soil, you have to probably resort to hydroponics to cultivate these plants. So actually, these units are very similar to the urban agriculture big containers that we're thinking about for Beckman. But then the question is that, well, the plant needs to thrive in a very different environment, in a foreign environment. And how do we help the plants grow better in those environments? In fact, NASA have already been doing small scale trials on International Space Station. So here, this image shows you a Veggie unit, which is very tiny, again, using LED light. And so one of the secondary goals is to be able to feed astronauts fresh vegetables in long space missions, so they don't have to always eat the packaged food. So our approach is that we're thinking about how to help the plants grow happier in a foreign environment. Well, what if we can put wearable electronics on them so that we can help translate the plant growth signal or the chemical signals into their happiness scale, and then tell the chambers what to do next to optimize the environment for the plants. So that's the idea. And printing electronics is really ideal for space missions because the fabricated sensors are really lightweight and you can make them on demand and very versatile. And also the material themselves are high performance. So here is our relatively young plant electronics team. So fortunate enough to be able to work with Jeff on designing molecules. And then a Helical group help us performing MD simulations also towards helping us understanding how to design molecules. And the Angelique group from plant biology offers valuable advice of how do we understand plant biology to cater to the plants. And with that, I would like to acknowledge my group. So the opportunity to work with talented students is one of the major reasons why I go to academia. And so I really value every member of my group and their contributions, collective contributions. And I also thank my collaborators, which I've shown throughout the talk today. And the work is mainly supported by NSF, ONR, and NASA. Thank you for your attention. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so since we're doing the hybrid, I wanted to explain a little bit how we're going to do the hybrid. So if you're online, thank you for joining us. Please put your questions in the chat and Patty will relay them to us. And if you're in the room, please ask your question, but to make sure that they're heard online, I'll ask Ying to repeat the question if you wouldn't mind doing that.
Yeah, I will.
So I'll start with the first question. In the helical structure that you described, I'm wondering whether you've thought about how you could design a helix that would really promote even greater connectivity. For example, could you imagine, a triple helix, or maybe you can imagine, almost like a dendritic kind of structure where there's, the ability to transport signal using that connectivity of the helix and so forth. I'm wondering if you're imagining taking that further to design new structures that would take advantage of the architecture of the helix.
Mm. Right. So the question is that whether we can reimagine how we design a helix to enhance transport as well. Right. That's a great question. So I think triple helix is very fascinating because of the bio-inspiration perspective. And if we can allow the adjacent helix, polymer chains to closely stack in the helix, I think we can potentially enhance transport. Right, that's something we haven't thought about before. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Right. Questions from the audience? We fed you, so you have to be a full question. Union.
Yes, I'm wondering about I'm wondering what aspect of how excited Bottlebrush I didn't by how or
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you for the question. So the question is, what is the limitations of the color range we can achieve in a structured color project? So we think that there is not much limit, right? Because we can easily extend to IR range or UV range by changing the polymer length itself, or by formulation approach, by adding additives. So so I think that it can be a very versatile approach to even extend further of the of the range, right? So the major challenge we're facing now is to go from 2D to 3D. That seems to be drastically reducing the assembly time. So the assembly is much slower when we do it in 3D. So it's very important to match the kinetics of printing with assembly, and right, that's been a limitation right now. Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing now. Right. I think the follow-up question is whether we can polymerize during the printing process to build up in 3D. Right. That so we have been working on that for a few months, basically polymerizing using UV laser, using cross-linkable chemistry. Right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great questions. So the questions that the helical structure for solar cells, what if we use non-fullerene acceptors? And then, right, I'll answer this part first. Right. So non-fullerene acceptors can be very interesting too. That's what we're looking at now. So these nuclear receptors, they have curved structures too, very similar to fullerene, although it's not spherical. So we think the curved structure can interact better with the curved structure of helix to enhance electronic coupling. And the second question is, since we're compromising transport while enhancing splitting, what's the real solar cell performance? So that we will have to, well, the transport, actually, we don't think it'll be a main problem because for solar cells, we don't need extraordinary transport properties. And the transport limit has been on the electron side, not the hole side, whereas we're engineering the hole polymers, hole conducting polymers to be helical. So usually the hole conduction is much faster than electron conduction, and this imbalance is a problem. But then, so we don't need to worry too much about hole transport in this case. So we can afford to take a hit in the transport properties while enhancing charge separation efficiency. Yeah. Thank you.
So it shows that you can control the charge transport by hitting a different speeds, even if that you could in theory do variable printing speeds and then further to that charge transport. And would you expect the physics to then become more complex and going from near equilibrium to further?
Right. That's a good question. So can we further vary the printing regimes or the printing speed range to further tune transport? Actually, we recently found that it's not, I presented a very simple scenario that there is a helix and there is stretched polymers, but actually it's much more complex than that. We found there are new helical structures that we discovered during printing. We still haven't figured out why that is. And the helix pitch is tuned in a non-monotonic fashion as well. So we're really intrigued by this and still trying to figure it out, right? And also another very interesting direction is spintronics. So actually we can leverage the chirality to separate spin current that have different angular momentum. So that has can enable quantum computing in the future. That's another direction that we're really excited about. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so I think we'll stop here. I just want to say, you've all imagined how we're in an era where we have wearables and they're telling us all about ourselves. And Ying has imagined that, to sort of the next level where plants have wearables, and we'll learn about them and how we can make them grow faster or better or taste better or be more nutritious. And maybe someday we'll have a controlled plant environment outside of Beckman, and your sensors will be feeding in information to the people who are consuming the food about what they might eat the next day. So with that, we'll stop and thank Ying for a great presentation.
Thank you.